The midday sun scorched the cracked asphalt of Reno, Nevada, on a blistering Thursday in July 2024, turning the horizon into a wavering haze of heat. Tucked off the highway, where the city unraveled into sagebrush and sand, stood Dusty Trail Coffee, a modest shack with weathered wooden walls and a tin roof that glinted under the relentless sky. Inside, the rich, bitter scent of roasted coffee beans curled through the air, blending with the dry desert breath that seeped through the open windows. It wasn't a glossy joint, no overpriced lattes or polished counters, just a rustic retreat where locals and wanderers grabbed a cup and a moment's peace. The kind of place that felt like it'd been there forever, etched into the dust. Clint Eastwood eased through the groaning door, his boots scraping the floorboards with a sound like a low rumble. At 94, the Hollywood icon had long since stepped back from the cameras, finding solace in this quiet corner he'd bought as an escape from fame's clamor. He wore a threadbare flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and jeans faded to a soft gray, their cuffs frayed from years of trails. A beat-up Stetson sat beside him as he slid into a corner booth by the window, his steely gray eyes drifting to the dusty road stretching into the distance. To the untrained eye, he was just another old-timer or relic of the West, blending into the sunburned landscape. Behind the counter, Sarah swiped a rag across the scratched oak, her motions quick and jagged. At 25, she was a tangle of frayed edges, dark hair, yanked into a messy bun, hazel eyes dulled by sleepless nights over bills and worries. She'd started here 3 months back, scrambling to chip away at nursing school debt and keep her teenage brother, Jake, fed and off the streets. Today, the strain was a vice. Jake's sneakers were splitting, the landlord was hounding her, and the coffee grinder had sputtered out twice already. She caught sight of Clint settling in, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Perfect," she muttered, the words barely a whisper over the hum of the air conditioner. "Another cheap old guy who'll nickel and dime me." Sarah was running on empty, the morning's mess still clawing at her nerves. A trucker had barked about lukewarm hash browns, a kid had appended a soda across the floor, and her boss, Bill, had hissed at her to hustle. Clint's unhurried arrival only fanned her simmering fuse. She snatched her notepad, marched over, and planted herself by his table, one hand on her hip. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice sharp, slicing through the quiet like a blade. Clint lifted his head, his gaze steady and piercing, cutting through her bristling front. For a split second, something flickered in those eyes, maybe recognition, maybe amusement, but it faded fast. "Just black coffee," he said, his voice a low growl, weathered and deep like it carried echoes of 1,000 stories. Simple, but it landed with a quiet weight that made Sarah's pen stall mid-air. She huffed, jotting it down. "That's it." She pressed, irritation slipping out. Clint gave a slight nod, unperturbed. "That's it." Sarah spun away, her sneakers squeaking against the wood as she headed back to the counter. "Big surprise," she grumbled, tossing the slip to the barista. But as she stacked mugs with a clatter, she felt Clint's eyes linger, a calm, searching look that brushed against her like a desert wind. She shrugged it off, blaming the heat. Another shift, another tip she had no clue how much she'd misread. The afternoon heat pressed harder against Dusty Trail Coffee as the lunch rush hit its stride, turning the little Reno outpost into a cauldron of chaos. Sarah darted between the counter and the tables, her sneakers sticking to the floor where syrup had dried from a spilled Coke earlier. The grinder had grown to a halt mid-morning, forcing her to brew batches by hand, and the line of grumbled truckers and sunburned tourists stretched longer with every passing minute. She just dodged a rant about watery iced tea when Bill, the manager, poked his head out from the back. "Sarah, pick it up!" He barked, his voice cutting through the clatter. "We're drowning out here." She bit back a retort, her jaw tight, and slammed a stack of cups onto the counter instead. The day was unraveling and she was fraying with it. Clint Eastwood sat undisturbed in his corner booth, the world's bustle bouncing off him like dust off a windshield. He'd finished half his coffee, the black liquid cooling in its chipped mug, when he caught Sarah's eye as she rushed past. "Could I get a slice of toast with this?" he asked, his gravelly voice steady, cutting through her storm like a low note on a guitar. Sarah froze mid-step, her notepad crumpling in her grip. She whipped around, eyes flashing. "You think I've got all day to wait on you?" she snapped, louder than she meant. The words spilled out, raw and jagged, fueled by hours of complaints and a headache pulsing at her temples. Clint didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly, his weathered hands resting on the table, and a faint smile curved his lips soft, almost amused. "I can wait," he said, calm as a desert sunset. "Take your time, miss." That cool-headed patience only stoked Sarah's fire. She crossed her arms, leaning in with a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you're one of those, huh? The kind who sits all day nursing a cheap coffee, figuring the world owes you something?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm, a shield against the day's weight. But Clint just tilted his head, unfazed, like he'd heard worse 1,000 times. Sarah spun away, her ponytail swinging, and stormed back to the counter. She poured his coffee refill with a scowl, then grabbed a slice of toast from the warmer, barely glancing at it. When she returned, she set the mug down hard, deliberately hard, sending a splash of dark liquid over the rim. The toast landed beside it with a dull thud. Clint glanced at the mess, then up at her, wiping his hand on a napkin with the same slow care he'd given everything else. "Thank you," he said, his tone even, but his gray eyes sharpened now, holding hers a beat longer than before. There was something in that look, not anger, not pity, but a quiet assessment, like he was peering past her sharp edges to whatever lay beneath. It unnerved her, though she couldn't say why. She muttered, "Yeah, sure," and turned away, brushing off the prickling on her neck. "He's nobody," she told herself, dodging a tray of dirty plates as she wove through the crowd. "Just some old guy with nothing better to do." But as she cleared a table nearby, piling forks with a clank, a regular named Tom leaned over from his stool at the counter. He was a wiry mechanic, all grease stains and easy grins, and he nodded toward Clint's booth. "Hey, Sarah," he whispered, voice low like he was sharing a secret. "You ever notice that old guy looks kind of familiar? Like someone we've seen before?" Sarah snorted, rolling her eyes as she dumped the plates into a bin. "What, Tom? You think he's Elvis reincarnated?" "I don't care who he looks like, he's just a weird old man." Tom shrugged, chuckling, but his words lingered in the air, a faint ripple she brushed aside. She was too buried in her own storm to see the truth creeping closer, waiting to turn her day upside down. The lunch rush at Dusty Trail Coffee finally ebbed as the clock ticked past 2 p.m., leaving the air thick with the hum of a tired ceiling fan and the faint clink of cups settling into silence. Sarah leaned against the counter, her apron smudged with coffee stains, wiping sweat from her brow with a ragged sleeve. Her nerves still jangled from the day's chaos, the broken grinder, Bill's sharp words, the sting of her own snapped retorts, but the crowd had thinned, giving her a moment to breathe. She glanced at Clint Eastwood's corner booth, where he sat finishing his toast, his Stetson resting beside him like a faithful shadow. He was still there, calm as ever, and it grated on her more than she cared to admit. The back door swung open with a creak, and Bill, the manager, stepped out from his office, his broad frame filling the doorway. He adjusted his glasses, squinting across the room, then froze. A grin broke across his weathered face, bright and unguarded, as he strode toward Clint's table. "Mr. Eastwood," he called, his voice booming with warmth. "Been ages since you dropped by. What a sight." Sarah's rag slipped from her hand, hitting the counter with a soft thud. She whipped her head around, eyes darting to Clint, who looked up with a slow nod. his gray gaze steady as Bill clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Thought you'd forgotten us out here in the dust." Sarah's stomach dropped like a stone kicked off a cliff. Eastwood? The name hit her like a freight train, dragging up memories of late-night movies she'd watched as a kid. Dirty Harry, Unforgiven, that squint she'd mimicked in the mirror. She stared at Clint, really looked at him now, past the faded flannel and dusty jeans. The lines on his face, the quiet steel in his posture, it was him. Clint Eastwood. Her mouth went dry, and a hot flush crawled up her neck as every snarky word she'd flung at him replayed in her head. "Oh my God," she whispered, barely audible over the fan's drone. "I just insulted Clint Eastwood." "And he owns this place?" Clint pushed his chair back, standing with a grace that belied his 94 years. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp $50 bill, more than his coffee and toast combined, and laid it on the table with a deliberate tap. Sarah's eyes widened. She'd been bracing for a dime, maybe a crumpled dollar. He adjusted his Stetson, tipping it slightly to Bill. "Place is holding up fine," he said, his gravelly voice low but firm. "But that girl over there," he nodded toward Sarah, who stood rooted behind the counter, her face flaming. "She could use a break. Looks like the day's riding her hard." Bill chuckled, oblivious to the storm brewing in Sarah's chest. "She's a fighter, Clint, just green." Clint's gaze flicked to Sarah for a moment, sharp and unreadable, then softened into something she couldn't place, maybe understanding, maybe a challenge. He gave Bill a final nod, picked up his hat, and headed for the door, his boots echoing faintly against the wood. Sarah watched, her breath caught somewhere between panic and disbelief, as the screen door slapped shut behind him. The $50 bill sat there, a quiet rebuke to her assumptions, and the weight of her words crashed down like sand through her fingers. She stumbled to the counter's edge, gripping it until her knuckles whitened. "Clint Eastwood," she muttered again, louder this time, as if saying it would undo the last hour. Tom, the mechanic, swiveled on his stool nearby, smirking. "Told you he looked familiar," he said, popping a fry into his mouth. Sarah shot him a glare, but it melted into something softer regret, maybe awe. Clint was gone, but his presence lingered, leaving her tangled in a knot of shame and a strange, nagging curiosity. She'd misjudged him badly, and now she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The next morning broke over Reno with a gentler light, the sun climbing lazily above the sagebrush as Dusty Trail coffee stirred awake. Sarah arrived at the cafe with a knot twisting in her gut, her sneakers dragging against the gravel lot. She hadn't slept. Clint Eastwood's face, his calm voice, and that $50 tip had haunted her all night, replaying alongside every sharp word she'd thrown at him. What if he'd told Bill? What if she was out of a job? She needed this gig. Jake's school fees were overdue, and the landlord's patience was thinning. She tied her apron with trembling hands, her eyes darting to the corner booth as she slipped behind the counter. It was empty, but the ghost of yesterday lingered. The door creaked open at 11 a.m., and there he was, Clint Eastwood, stepping in like he'd never left. Same faded flannel, same worn jeans, same Stetson tucked under his arm. He moved with that slow, deliberate grace, settling into his booth by the window as if the chaos of the day before was just dust on his boots. Sarah's breath caught, her pulse thudding in her ears. She wiped her palms on her apron, forcing her feet forward, each step heavier than the last. She stopped at his table, clutching her notepad like a shield. "Mr. Eastwood," she started, her voice small and shaky. I'm so sorry about yesterday." "I didn't mean." Clint raised a hand, cutting her off mid-stumble. "No need for apologies," he said, his gravelly tone soft but firm, like a steady wind over the desert. He leaned back, his gray eyes locking onto hers, not accusing, but searching. "But there's something you ought to know." Sarah froze, her throat tightening as she braced for a reprimand. She'd messed up badly, and now the legend himself was about to lay into her. But Clint's expression didn't harden. It stayed calm, almost gentle. "Life's tough on everybody," he said slowly, each word measured, sinking deep. "I've had my share of rotten days when I didn't know if I'd make it through. But how you treat folks, even over something as small as a cup of coffee, that's what shows who you are." He paused, letting the silence settle, his gaze never wavering. Sarah's chest tightened, her eyes dropping to the floor. Shame burned hot in her cheeks, but his voice wasn't harsh. It was steady, like a hand pulling her back from an edge. "I didn't know who you were," she whispered, barely audible, her voice cracking. "I was just so tired." Clint nodded, a faint crease softening his brow. "I could see that," he said, and for the first time, a small, kind smile tugged at his lips. Not the squinting grin of his movie posters, but something real, weathered by years. "But here's the thing. You can turn that tired into something good. Everyone's worth a little kindness. Doesn't matter who they are." He tapped the table lightly, the sound a quiet punctuation to his words. Sarah looked up, meeting his eyes, and saw no judgment there, just a spark of something warm, urging her to listen. He stood then, pulling the Stetson onto his head with a practiced tilt. "Keep that in mind," he said, his voice a low rumble as he turned toward the door. "You'll figure it out." The screen slapped shut behind him, leaving a stillness that pressed against Sarah's ribs. She sank onto a stool, her notepad slipping to the counter, Clint's words echoing in her skull like a bell she couldn't unring. Tiredness, yes, she'd felt it for months. A weight dragging her down. But good? Could she really turn it into that? Regret stung, sharp and bitter, but beneath it, something else flickered. A tiny, tentative glow of possibility. Clint had seen her, not just her snarl, and he'd left her with more than a lesson. He'd left her with a choice. The weeks that followed Clint Eastwood's visit slipped by like dust settling after a storm, and Sarah found herself shifting beneath the weight of his words. At Dusty Trail Coffee, she started small, offering a tired single mom a warm smile as she wrangled her toddler, chatting with an old man about his long-gone dog while refilling his mug, holding her tongue when a trucker griped about slow service. It wasn't easy. Exhaustion still gnawed at her, and the bills didn't vanish. But each time she chose patience over a snap, something softened inside her. The job wasn't just a paycheck anymore. It was a thread, fragile but real, tying her to the people who shuffled through that creaky door. She began to see them, really see them, and it changed her more than she'd expected. One quiet afternoon, Bill caught her behind the counter, his gruff voice breaking her thoughts. "You're doing good, Sarah," he said, folding his arms with a rare grin. "Folks like you more these days, keep it up." She blinked, a flush of pride warming her cheeks. Later that week, Clint slipped in unannounced, his Stetson low as he took his usual booth. Sarah didn't notice him at first. She was laughing with a little girl over a spilled sugar packet, wiping the mess with a gentle, "No big deal, sweetie." From across the room, Clint watched, his gray eyes crinkling with a faint, approving nod before he left without a word. That evening, Sarah stepped outside as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert gold. She leaned against the cafe's wall, gazing down the dusty road Clint had walked. "Every moment's a chance," she murmured, Clint's lesson settling deep. Kindness didn't just lift others. It mended her too, one small act at a time.